I'm Gregg Jarrett for FoxNews.com. 3 million votes are up for grabs. That's the number of voters with disabilities who apparently stayed home in the last presidential election because of access barriers to the ballot box. The disability advocacy group, the Ruderman Foundation, recently put out a white paper on this very issue. It found 5 recurring barriers to voting for people with disabilities. They include insufficient poll worker training, barriers to poll access, barriers to election and registration material, stigma, and a lack of resources available to election officials. Here now with me, Tina Kopich, who is co-author of the Ruderman White Paper and an advocacy content specialist at the foundation. It probably astonishes a lot of people that roughly 20% of Americans have some sort of recognized disability. But 3 million people, arguably are disenfranchised when they vote. Talk to us about that.
So you're right. Most people are very surprised when they hear that approximately 20% of the U.S. population has a disability under the ADA definition, Americans with Disabilities Act definition. When we say the 3 million figure that you just cited, that is based on a study that was conducted in 2012, voter turnout of voters with disabilities. If voters with disabilities voted at the same rates as their counterparts without disabilities, but otherwise equal in all demographic factors, then we would have 3 million more voters with disabilities.
It's really astounding. All right, let's talk about the barriers. The first one that comes to mind are the physical barriers. Now, whenever I go to the voting place, there's a ramp to allow for people with physical disabilities to gain access, but it's a one-floor building. So how prevalent are the ramps and accessible for disabled people and those that don't have them?
Right. That is a great question. It's also very difficult to fully quantify. But in 2008, the Government Accountability Office also did a study and found that up to 73% of all polling places had some kind of access barrier. That is just an astounding number. The good news is it was up from 2004 and 2000. Down. Right. From 2004 to 2008.
What about transportation? People with disabilities have transportation problems all the time, but they do gain access to trains and buses that allow them, some special access.
Yes. Transportation, in this white paper that we wrote, we interviewed 10 experts, one of them being Congressman Langevin, who was the first quadriplegic congressman to be elected to Congress. He basically said that public transportation and transportation, sadly, is one of the factors that has still not really been solved. Yeah. How do we solve that? There's no great answers.
Money.
Money is one, but as we know, money is also scarce. Where will it come from? Ultimately, if we already enforced the existing transportation that is in place, if we made sure that buses were accessible, if we made sure trains were fully accessible, that would already reduce the problem quite severely.
What about people with developmental, emotional, intellectual disabilities? Are they discriminated against?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. One thing that was also interesting in our white paper that we found is the U.S. actually compares very favorably to other developed countries around the world when it comes to voting access, when it comes to including our people in our democracy and making sure everyone gets a vote. Unfortunately, we do not compare favorably when it comes specifically to people with mental or developmental disabilities.
Some states discriminate. They don't allow them to vote?
Absolutely. Some states in their state constitutions have a clause that says if you are found incompetent, you are disenfranchised.
Who decides competency?
The courts, and that's another thing that is not standardized. So if you are a judge who feels, let's say, has bias for whatever reason, and you see a person with a disability and you just don't feel that, let's say, a person with Down syndrome can decide who to vote for, you have the legal right to declare them incompetent in certain states.
With all of these barriers you've identified, transportation, the physical barriers at the voting places, intellectual, developmental, psychological discrimination, which is truly outrageous to a great many people, I would imagine. What can be done to improve all of this?
That would be the, million-dollar question, right? I think ultimately we have to recognize that the election authorities of every state are doing the best they can. And we have to recognize that this is an incredibly complex and complicated problem. The biggest complication comes when we see that every state has different laws when it comes to administering elections.
Right.
And sometimes it even is divided further into county by county differences. So some counties might mandate absolutely accessible, let's say, registrations online. You have to have accessible website. The county next door might not have that. And so that's where the complication comes in. So it really has to start from the bottom, making sure we raise awareness of every single person in order to help people with disabilities advocate for themselves further.
Does there need to be a push by election officials everywhere to make sure that in advance election materials are specially made available to people with, disability challenges, and also encourage them to make better use of absentee ballots?
Yes and no. So yes, election officials do play a huge role in making sure that people with disabilities have their civil rights met. However, if we rely on absentee ballots, which oftentimes that is the thing that's brought up when we talk about this white paper, it's like, oh, people with disabilities can't vote, but can't they vote absentee? Like, why do they have to go to the poll?
Right.
If I want to say there are certain states that are mail-in ballots only. Everyone just votes by mail.
Right.
So I'm not talking about those states. I'm speaking of states that have in-person voting. If you create a system in those states where people with disabilities are expected to vote absentee, but everyone else can go to the polls, you have a discriminatory and segregated system. That is not in the spirit of our democracy.
How is it discriminatory if their vote counts just as much as a non-disabled person who goes to the polling place?
Right, great question. So because it is segregated. So we know in the history of our country, separate but equal is problematic. So if you have separate voting systems, you can make the argument that that is not okay, especially not, like I said, it is not in the spirit of our democracy.
Yeah, but it doesn't alter the way they're going to vote, does it? And ultimately, the key point is they get to vote and their vote counts as much as everybody else's, right?
Yes, you can certainly, and a lot of people are making that argument. Me and my co-writer in the Ruderman Foundation maintain that that is not equality. Right. And there's another reason. The same study I cited in 2012 that measured the voter turnout of people with disabilities showed that people with disabilities prefer to vote in person. It is kind of, as we all know, it's this beautiful private but public event where you go and really get to participate in your democracy. And then you get that little sticker.
Every year that an election is held, more and more people vote by absentee ballot. And, I envision the day 50, 100 years from now where there are no polling places. Everybody votes, maybe electronically or maybe with hand ballots, but they do it in the mail. We'll wait and see. Tina Kupich, interesting subject. Thank you for explaining it. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Stick with us at foxnews.com for updates on this story and complete election coverage. I'm Gregg Jarrett. Thanks for being here.